Dittamo. I recognize many of you. In case some of you don't recognize me, I'm a second-year master's student in musicology and composition. Between my bachelor's degree and my master's, I spent 4 years as a logistics officer in the United States Army. And my bachelor's was in music composition from the College of William and Mary, where I also studied early music under Ruth Nafme. Previously, Nafme was kind enough to ask me fall last year to discuss Renaissance instruments, and I'm amazed that you invited me back because I went way too long. But you did, so you're stuck. Much as I would love to tell you that you should put crumb horns in the hands of kindergartners, that's not what I'm here to do. However, I can't leave you without a little bit of crumb horn, so... Help my fingers up at the holes at the bottom. Okay, that was a crumb horn, by the way, a Renaissance double reed instrument with a reed hidden beneath the cap. Part of a family of capped double reeds. These capped double reeds only have the range of an octave and a second, that is to say, a ninth, because you have your loops on the reed. They died out after instruments such as the oboe appeared. But in the late Renaissance, people did blow them reed and mouth. You blow so hard the reed is forced to vibrate. But that's not what I'm here to talk about, because sadly, virtually no public school in the world has the budget to outfit elementary or secondary or high schoolers with crumb horns. Goodbye. So, I'm here to talk about early music in the classroom. Now, what are we talking about when we talk about early music? Conventionally, we are talking about music pre-1750. That is an arbitrary date chosen because that's when Bach happened to croak. There's music that is considered early that was written after Bach died. But that said, by the time Bach had died, his music was very much out of fashion. So really, it starts to peter out in the 1730s, 40s. So this doesn't include antiquity, that is to say, music of the Greeks and Romans. That's generally considered the province of musical archaeology, which is a separate discipline. Early music encompasses, generally speaking, 3 main style periods. The medieval, which historians calculate being from the fall of Rome in 476 to about 1400. For our purposes, it starts at the advent of musical notation around the year, around the millennium mark, around 1000. The Renaissance, circa 1400/1450 to 1600, and the Baroque, 1600 to 1750, when Bach snuffed it. So, scholarly musicians have been earnestly engaged in studying historically informed performance of music of this era since about the 1960s. And what that means is reconstructing music and performing it as it was intended at the time it was first performed, using the means that the original performers had at their disposal as best we can recreate them. This represents a time, early music, an expansive time in which the fundamental principles of our common musical system we use today were still in flux, still in development. To think about it, Rameau's Treatise on Harmony, that's covered in Music History 2 for those of you who haven't taken it yet, in 1722, is the first to really talk about music in the terms of chords. This entire concept of focusing on triad construction is a late innovation. Before that, they were all talking about lines, and everything vertical was an interrelationship that occurred through good line writing, not through chordal writing. In fact, Roman numeral analysis doesn't even come until the last 100 years or so. So Bach wouldn't know what to do with a Roman numeral. Now, there are a vast variety of ways that one could integrate early music into a primary, secondary school curriculum, but one of the most apparent, right off the bat, is where it is already after a fashion. The recorder curriculum that occurs typically in the 4th and 5th grade years in American primary schools. So, let's talk about the recorder. It's an iconic instrument for early music. It's a very accessible instrument because you don't need a special embouchure to make it sound. It's also infamous, because you don't need a special embouchure to make it sound, and legions of grade schoolers have tortured one another, teachers and parents with them. And this is due to, in large part, to the efforts of Karl Orff, who used them along with his other so-called Orff instruments because of their durability, once you have them in a resin form, pretty indestructible, and their simplicity.
Yes.
So, what is a recorder? It's obviously a woodwind. Distinguishing features of a recorder are the duct or fipple, that window right here, and 8 holes, not counting double holes, of course. 7 on top and a thumb hole in the back. It has a historical pedigree taking it back to the 14th century or earlier, and was preceded by centuries of simpler duct flutes, that is to say, duct flutes that didn't have thumb holes in back and had typically fewer holes on front, be it a 6-holed flute, or in some cases a 3-holed flute, in which you're overlaying with a narrow bore. And in the Middle Ages, this is when it came about, it was described by theorists as the flute of 9 holes. Why am I saying 9? I mean, we just said there were 8 holes, 1 on back, 7 on top. No, it's not the window. So, fingering was not standardized in this era. So, you would have 2 pinky holes on bottom, and when you got your recorder from the maker, he'd ask which side you wanted it to play with. So you want to have right on bottom, left on top, or vice versa. And whichever you didn't want, you would plug the 9th hole with wax or clay. So, and the recorder was the flute in this era. If you said flute, you meant this. Transverse flute was a bastard cousin. It came into Europe out of Asia Minor around the time of the Crusaders. Although the Etruscans did have a transverse flute, but let's not get into the Etruscans. Okay, so the medieval flute was, as a recorder, was entirely cylindrical, just a straight bore. And this affects the sound. Now, we do have some surviving medieval recorders. The earliest is from Dordrecht. That's the instrument that this is modeled after. It's found in the Netherlands in 1958 in a boat. There's another at Göttingen, found in 87 in Germany in a medieval latrine. Another found in 2002 in a mill channel settlement in Esslingen. The Tartu recorder in Estonia, found in 2006 in a latrine from the 14th century. A Polish instrument from Elbag, found in 99 in a latrine from the mid-15th century. And another Polish instrument found after World War II in a 14th century latrine. So, why latrines?
Iconic.
Read it together, class. So, why latrines? There are 2 ways to think about this. But also, all these instruments that are found are soprano size. What we call soprano in modern nomenclature. Also, I apologize if my voice gives out. As Morgan was telling me, my husband has informed her I got the plague.
Yes.
So if I keel over during this talk, just let me let someone else deal with it. But at least I'll get out of Parker's midterm on Bruckner tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on. So, why latrines? First off, there's the prospect that perhaps they were disposing of instruments that had been damaged or otherwise were deemed unsuitable. I have another theory. So, if you're a medieval recordist playing your night gig at the castle, when you go to relieve yourself, you might just stick your instrument in a pocket and, oops. Whatever she's on, I want it.
My brother is why.
Okay. High on life or otherwise, in the 15th century, the recorder becomes a consort instrument. In the late 14th, we see Beardung. He describes recorders coming in 3 sizes, similar to these. A soprano, alto, and a tenor. I don't have the tenor of this particular style yet. But tenor would be twice the length of a soprano. And so in the 15th century, they become a consort instrument. In the High Renaissance, virtually every instrumental family was played in consorts, mixtures of like instruments, same construction, but different sizes, like you see here. Soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And by the time we get to the 1600s, the family expands out. There's a sopranino, 2/3 this length, and the Garklein flute line, the very small tiny flute, as well as a great bass, which is twice the length of this tenor, and a contrabass twice the length of this bass.
Once you've ever seen it.
Big news for Pelagian folks. We have a great bass by maker Kovacevic coming secondhand from Von Huna that the university has purchased. So that will be exciting for those of you interested in recorder, consort. You notice this one doesn't have a beak. It has. Oh,
I'm sorry if I died in your video.
Do it again.
I would remove this cap to show you the cap, what's underneath, but it's not coming tonight. It's too humid. Okay, just a demonstration for sound.
Yes.
Stop it.
How do all the great bass?
So, the great bass and contrabass have vocals like a bassoon, so you have a tube that goes up to the cap on top. And some have key work. Interestingly, so you notice that the key work on these instruments down when you get to the bottom, this is called a fontanelle. It covers the hole and the key work, because in the Renaissance they thought key work was very ugly. They also didn't have those convenient cylindrical systems like you see on Böhm flutes. So it's all springs and things, so rather unattractive. But you notice they have what we call swallowtail keys, and this is because, again, hand position was not standardized, so lefty-righty or righty-lefty, you had the choice. All right, now, so notice that the Renaissance recorder gets a bit of an inverse taper going on. This gets carried out to the extreme in the Baroque era, the era of Bach and his company. Well, so we go from cylindrical to inverse taper with a slight flare out, and then we get an extreme taper, and the bore shrinks considerably. And this affects the sound. This makes the bottom register, which is, by the way, the register that kidlings are starting on in their 4th, 5th grade instruction, very weak, but also makes the upper register very reedy and resounding. And this emerges in the mid-17th century, and this is the form that is used in schools today. So, first off, how can we make elementary recorder classes more tolerable? Because this is an art instrument, it is not a toy. Now, some of the instruments they're playing are toys, but we'll get there. So, first, recognize that the instrument is not the problem. It's the kids. What I mean by this is not that children are evil or in any way intrinsically wrong or disorderly. But what I am saying is that if you put any instrument in the hands of a whole class of 20-odd kids and tell them, okay, let's all play the same thing, it's going to be painful. It's almost guaranteed, unless you are at some bizarrely perfect admixture of people and conditions. So, that's the first step. So if you gave them all trumpets, they have the same issues. If you gave them all bazookies, same issues. The next thing to recognize is that the instrument is the problem. I know whiplash. So, what I do is, I mentioned some of the instruments they're playing may be toys. These two recorders seem rather similar. I know the coloration difference, but we won't hold that against them. not come out. Okay.
And
What in your nose?
What's going on? They're not in tune.
They're on tune,
We
yeah.
discussed this in tuning and temperament in music degree 1. We are having beats.
Yep.
So, these instruments, virtually identical in manufacture from different companies, are now in tune with one another. Let's see here. Slightly better. Getting there. Anyway, so I had to pull this out about 2 millimeters to get them close to in tune. So, what's the easiest way to get around having to hand tune a bunch of recorders in the hands of kittens? Yes.
Force them all to get the exact same one.
Yes. So, in some situations, you have a stockpile of your own instruments in your classroom. And I will get on to things for high school type level education as well. Play the set song quickly. Okay, so standardize, if at all possible. So if you're able to have them all have the same model of instrument, that automatically reduces your pain. Make sure that they're all the way in, and they should be, apart from their back pressure, in tune with one another. There's another thing to be aware of, and it's called German fingering. So when these instruments were being revived in the 30s and 40s for school usage in Europe, they had this concern. You see, if you start to scale on a recorder, we have what's called a forked fingering on F on a C instrument. Oh, by the by, C instrument, F instrument, C instrument, F instrument, imaginary great bass, C instrument, imaginary contrabass, F instrument. Okay, that was not the way it was in the Renaissance, but it's the way we do it now. Long story. Pretorius said we should do it though, and I trust my brother Pretorius. Sometime in music in 1618, look it up. Okay, so they didn't like these forked fingerings because it's a scale. We should just do one finger at a time like on the piano. So how do we fix that? Well, they made this hole here a little bigger, this hole a little smaller, and then you can play it in a straight scale up. The issue is that then things up above get horrendously out of tune, and there's no way to correct it. But if you're only playing the first octave, you're fine. Well, a lot of times you'll find in instruments that maybe you're sitting on people's houses or in schoolrooms that you may have a mix of instruments, some of which are German fingered and some of which are called English fingered. That's not actually because the fingering was originated by the English, it's because Karl Dolmetsch in the 1900s took a strong stance against German fingering and leveraged it under his own nationality. So nationalism's in play here. Anyway, you have forked fingerings going back to Virda in the late 14th century. So, one, make sure there are no German fingered recorders hiding in your flock. Another thing, as I mentioned, to try to get all the same model, same company for tuning's sake. And if you happen to be in a position where you are buying a new batch of recorders for your ensemble, your classroom, if possible, go for quality. Yamaha 300 series, soprano is about $15 a piece. I realize that's pricey, but it is, well, for an elementary school budget, but it is worth it. Similar, Aulos and Xenon make recorders of similar quality. They also have lower tier models, and again, if you can't go for quality, go for uniformity. And don't succumb to this notion that wooden instruments, because they're made of wood, are real instruments and therefore better. The lower tier wooden instruments are much worse than even this this crappy Tudor recorder. So the resin instruments are by and large uniform and will be more consistent than half-assed wooden ones, if you'll pardon my language. Okay.
It's okay.
So, moving beyond soprano recorders, because part of the problem, as we said, is the instrument, but it's also not the instrument. So, if you have older students with bigger hands, try to make it standing out, looking at bringing alto and tenor recorders into play. Right? Some kids, after they have their experience with the soprano recorder, really like it, and I remember a kid grade school, asked the band director when she came around, making the pitch to join band, can you play recorder in band? And she kind of hemmed and hawed. So there are people who may be interested in doing this in their subsequent grade levels. If they're in the same building as you, that's great. And then what you could do is explore doing consort music in trios or small groups with the better members of your soprano recorder class. That can be a goal or a prize, an incentive, something that they want to be part of. Next is to move beyond hot cross buns. And what I mean by this is to try to find music that's worth the meal. Give them something to chew on, and don't insult their musical intelligence if at all possible. Now, that can be hard because how do you know what works on these blasted instruments that don't come with the standard flute, clarinet database of repertoire and all that fun stuff?
Hello?
Now, there are resources out there in the wide, wide world. One is the ARS, the American Recorder Society.
Oh my
And
God.
these, they're very much enthusiasts, so you have a broad mix. But they have chapters across the country, and many of them tend to be either crazy young people like me, or people associated with the Society for Creative Anachronism, or retirees with lots of time on their hands.
Yeah.
And that can be a good thing, because if you have proficient players in your community, you can reach out to them, bring them in to demonstrate how this instrument can be used, and then you can collaborate with them. I know that even the Kansas City Symphony does a thing each year where they have Kansas City area schools play recorders en masse along with the orchestra. I don't know how they do it musically, I haven't experienced it, but apparently it is pleasant enough. All right. Also, so they have resources for independent young players as well as for teachers, including educational videos. And there are more things available to you, including free sheet music, if you are a member. There's also Early Music America, which caters perhaps a little more esoteric crowd, the crowd that may pull out a crumhorn now and again. Now, both have initiatives and grant programs for educational activities. And in fact, I believe the ARS helped underwrite the recorder workshop we had last year, and there should be another one coming up in the spring. Stay tuned, and Mr. David Wood should have word on that in the future. But one of the sticking points is music, and here's something where we can broaden out beyond just elementary classrooms and on to people who may be going into high school choral and band programs. Starting with the choristers out there. I apologize if it's redundant information, some of you may already know about such things, but CPDL, the Choral Public Learning Library. And this is a mixture of several things. It includes people who have edited repertoire that's in public domain, early music, pre-1750, and even some after 1750. And also composers and arrangers who put things out there for the world to use. And this puts centuries of repertoire at your fingertips. So let's say you want to do Thomas Tallis's If You Love Me, a nice little verse anthem with your choir. Well, you could shell out $1.35 for an octavo, or you could buy a collection of Tudor anthems from OUP, Oxford University Press, for probably $15 a copy. Or you can look it up in CPBL. You have a range of transpositions, the original notated pitch, or others more suited to modern pitch standards and voices. People who are Music History 1 will remember I had a session on pitch standards the other day. And then you can see what you have to work with. In this case, it's a men's choir version. Now, of course, given that this is essentially a Wikipedia-type database, you deal with a variety of quality. As you know, there'll probably be a good Wikipedia entry on the properties of the amino acid glycine, but maybe not so good of a one on the ethical ramifications of campaign finance law, given that there are people with stakes editing, or perhaps perhaps not one on the rare and endangered South African polka-dotted bumblebee, which I just made up.
Okay,
So, you have to use your musical intelligence when assessing this sort of resource. There are similar, smaller scale databases devoted to smaller areas. For example, Spanish composers, particularly Thomas Luis de Victoria, and a whole open source edition of Guillaume Dufay through Diam. Guillaume Dufay, William Dufay. Okay. Now, CPDL is not limited to just early music. You can also find things like, Handel's Messiah. If you just want to do a number of Messiah and with your chorus or with the soloist, you don't need to necessarily go out and buy the sheet music. You just need the paper and ink. Now I realize sometimes even paper and ink is at a premium, but it's still less expensive than buying straight from Novello for the Watkins Shaw edition. Now again, these sorts of things require a bit of musical intelligence on your part, because sometimes, particularly for Baroque music, you have things that don't have realized continuo. That is to say, it will have the bass line, but without the chords realized above it, because they were jazzers in those days, and they kept things simple. Okay. Now, a massive, much larger database out there is IMSOP, the Internet Music Scored Library Project, also known as the Petrucci Music Library, named after Ottavio Petrucci, who was the first to create printed music. And this is a massive database for all types of instrumentation. And again, you have both people editing music in the public domain and also sometimes providing their own music for the world. And if you're looking for music for small ensembles that's accessible, Pretorius's, remember that name? Terpsichore, named after the muse of dance, is a great source for the top hits of Renaissance dance. Yes. That's not it. Don't be scared. So, this is the PDF, and it's just hundreds of pages of simple Renaissance dances in 4 or 5 parts.
sorry, I tried.
So all sorts of dances of various styles and speeds. And if you just want real music that's not coming out of some hack's head when they're trying to fill a book for young recordists, here you have a ton of melody lines that are accessible. You can also just do duets with the top lines. Or if you were able to build up a consort with recordists, you can play in 4 or 5 parts. Yes, I know the 5th part's in tenor, alto clef. It's a good thing to learn though. Anyway, also, this is something that you can look at in a band context. You could make arrangements of this music, or simply you can do small ensemble numbers during your concerts, because not everything needs to be full band. So you could take, let's just say, your clarinets, and let your clarinets in splitting parts on the upper lines, and bass clarinets on the bass. You have a consort. Now, another resource similar is Susato's Dancery, and just more sources of top dance tunes of the Renaissance. There's another thing that's particularly accessible, and this applies to both choral and instrumentalists. As I slowly die. And that's the Bicinia tradition. So, in the Renaissance, it was custom for a composer to set them out to prove themselves. Their first publication would be texted or untexted collections of music for 2 voices, demonstrating that they could do imitative counterpoint with 2 voices, the barest materials available to a composer outside of monophony, but do it in an artful and interesting way. And so there are tons and tons of these Bicinia, or Bicinium, singular, by composers. Here's an example of a simple one by Toscan. This one is actually a fugue. He originally just wrote the first line and told you, start a second higher. And in this case, it's pretty much staying within the first octave of the instrument. So you don't have to do your quarter music with your grade schoolers all in total unison, single part the whole time. You have options open to you. And you don't even necessarily, in some instances, print out the music. You could, if you have the capability, you could do something like this here. Now, also broadening out. ISLP has a very wonderful feature where you can look at genres, and you can look at by types of work, be it, I always wanted to play a hornpipe with my band, or I wanted to dance an Alamán today, or you can look by instrumentation, and you can get pretty nitty-gritty into details. There's even a whole section, this is outside the realm of early music by and large, for the wind band. And the majority of these include the parts. So if you're short on repertoire and you don't have much of a music purchasing budget, this is open to you. But again, you always have to use a discriminating eye. And one of the great things about IMSLP is not only do you get people editing in early music or putting their own music out there, music that's fallen into the public domain that was previously published can be scanned and uploaded here. In fact, sometimes you'll see designators against files saying, not public domain in the EU, or non-PD USA, which tells you that, oh, if you're in the US and you download this, you're actually violating the law. But there's servers on Canada. Okay. Now, so you're ready to put in some work with these sorts of resources because you're getting what you pay for. But that said, you can get many of the great gems of G. Schirmer's era-written vocal scores on IMSLP. Now, positive traits of early music. Like I said, it's public domain, much can be had for free. But also, you have comparatively simple notational practices. Because this is before the Romantic Revolution, where you're trying to cycle through all 24 possible keys and they're on. So you have larger note values, easier for younger brains to read, as well as typically simpler key signatures, which also work out well when you're dealing with instruments like recorders, where the more, or any instrument really, the more complex your accidentals get, the more cross-frame reads you're going to encounter. Also, there's another aspect. So, with that Josquin piece, notice there's not a lot of interpretive information. There are no dynamics, no retard here. And one of the great things about this era of music is that there was a performance practice tradition, and people were embarrassed to write out things that were obvious. So, you had to be engaging with your music in a critical manner. You were actually a co-creator in many cases with the composer. And so, one of the great things, appropriately managed in a classroom setting, is that you can teach musicianship through this music. By not having pianos and mezzofortes tossed all over the place, you can focus on, well, what are line dynamics? What is implied by this musical texture? And while we tend to try to think about these things as more advanced concepts for older musicians, music is easier when you make it musical. And it's never too early to start breeding in that analytical thinking into music making. So, the possibilities are endless. You're only limited by your imagination, your knowledge of music history, which helps you assess the repertoire you're encountering, and how much work or adaptation you're willing to put in to the end product. And with that, I open the floor to questions. Yes?
So, are there any other like early musical instruments that you would also consider bringing into the early music classroom other than recorder, or alongside recorder?
The recorder is most accessible. I know there are programs out there where they teach music based off of string instruments and using early repertoire with modern strings. The chief barrier at this point in the early music revival is the price point to access instruments. While most early instruments are perhaps less expensive than the professional flute or clarinet you're going to play after you get to a certain level, there aren't a lot of starter instruments at lower price points. I would love to say go for bringing shawms in, but again, when you're talking about other instruments, like perhaps looking at shawms or cornemuse or crumhorns, that would entail almost certainly some grant writing, in which you'd need to make a case for how this expenditure is validated in the benefit it can bring to your student body. So you would need to find an administrator of appropriate bent who would be open to that sort of enrichment. And I wish this were a different decade in this country. Anyway, Aaron.
So you couldn't get the bass recorder's top off, but what would we expect? Oh, sorry, that was scary.
Oh, sure. Actually, I can demonstrate with this. So, you would see, like this, a tenon wrapped, in this case, with cork, and the windway here. On this medieval recorder, it's very wide. It'd be very thin and curved on the Renaissance recorder. It's just swollen with some humidity. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Yes. All right, Jane.
In your experience, forgive me, I forget. Have you taught before this instrument or in elementary or secondary yet?
Not in elementary setting.
Okay.
So this is me looking at my elementary experience, what I see peripherally from peers of mine who are in elementary and secondary music education, and thinking, how could this be applicable? How could this be usable?
Right. Because from what I remember in my elementary experience, that was the only time I ever touched a recorder, and we did it every single year, but we never really put it into practice in terms of like a performance. We would always just do it in class, and it was just something that was kind of just like added, just for the sake of adding it.
Yeah.
And so I guess, how could we, in your opinion, how could you translate building the practice into making it somewhat of a performance? Are there any special activities you would go about using in order to make that a possibility, or?
Well, I think that there are opportunities for collaboration in other venues. You're probably not going to have a case where you can do a whole concert of recorder music with 4th and 5th graders. But what you could do is collaborate with choral and band and ensembles, so that we could have a segment of a concert where you demonstrate this. Or back when I was going through elementary, there'd be assemblies and pageants and things where there wouldn't be necessarily a set pattern of events where things could be inserted. And so I would advocate finding opportunities like that, and pitching, getting the go, and working with your students towards a goal.
Yep.
Yes.
When you're working with different types of recorders with small children, how do you, in a setting, teach all of them at once and maintain that sort of balance in the classroom among people with different recorder types?
Well, in the younger ages, you're probably not going to be able to have the larger sizes simply because of hand size. So in that instance, as I mentioned, it's an opportunity where if you have older students who enjoy recorder, to bring them in on larger sizes. And then otherwise, if you're trying to do two-part music that's for equal voices, that is to say soprano-soprano, then dividing the Red Sea and having them each two apart. And it may, and probably when you're working early on with two-part music, it would be wise to start by teaching everyone the one part, teaching everyone the second part, and then splitting them. So that you have reinforcement, and so you have strong players guiding everyone along the way as they're running each part, and then splitting out. Okay. Are there seconds available? For
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Have seconds, folks. Thank you, Howard.
All right. Thank you.
So that's all we have today, so please eat more food. It's mac and cheese.
Don't feel
And
obligated.
then, please eat it. And so then, that's probably all we got for today. If you guys didn't sign in, please sign in on the notebook that's over there by Ryan, which I'll hold up. And you guys are all good to go. Bye.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Arden.
Is there anyone that didn't sign in?
Now we can